Hello, world. Come on in. I love how on Zoom, we can't quite see how many people have showed up yet, but I'm visualizing right now that everybody's taking a seat and is ready to get started for today's edition of the COVID-19 Effect. We're going to be talking about transportation. I say that as one of our minibuses actually just drives by right in front of my window. Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Stojkovic. I am the Executive Director of SF.citi. I want to thank all of y'all for not only spending your lunch with us today, but you're spending a really sunny lunch with us. So I hope some people are at least hanging out at a park with their computer up. So I'm going to do some quick housekeeping notes, and then we will go over a couple brief points about today's discussion, and then I will bring on the man of the hour, Director Tumlin himself. Sound good? Great. So first off, today's discussion is going to be a moderated chat followed by a Q&A. What that means is at any time in today's conversation, including right now, you can put all of your burning public transit questions in the Q&A. So if you look right at the bottom of the screen, you see that little Q&A button. You can submit all of your questions on there. I will try my absolute best to get to as many questions as possible. I think this will be a very lively Q&A because transportation, everybody's got thoughts on this one. So we really look forward to everyone's questions. We are going to be recording today's webinar. So if you missed something, some sort of burning detail, or you really want to share it with your friends and family, please share it with your friends and family. We will be sending out the link afterwards and it will be available. Lastly, please share your thoughts about today's discussion using the hashtag the COVID-19 effect. And you can tag SF.citi on Twitter. We'll pop that over there into the chat. And there it is. Awesome. Okay, well, let's get to it. I'm going to go through a couple quick points and then we will bring up the director. So bear with me un momento. All right. So I hope everybody was able to do their homework. We actually sent out a blog last week and we detailed some of today's conversation, but in case you didn't get a chance to read through that, I'm going to cover a couple of the quick TLDR. So first off, who is SF.citi? We are San Francisco's Tech Trade Association. We were founded way back in 2012 after the last recession, actually, to connect San Francisco's burgeoning tech industry with the community and with the government so that we can work together to make San Francisco the best place to live and work. One of the things that you may know us for is over the last few months, we have been providing the industry's SF Tech COVID-19 update. So we send this bad boy out every Monday morning and provide the comprehensive guide to everything tech going on in San Francisco as it pertains to the pandemic. You'll be getting updates from the city of San Francisco, the state of California, and the tech industry every single Monday. You can go to sfciti.org if you want to check out the running resource as well. Okay, so let's get to this TLDR. Transportation. Obviously, the way that we travel is going to look drastically different than it did before. And unfortunately for us, that may indeed mean longer commutes. One of the biggest concerns facing transit experts is the shift away from public transit and towards private cars. A study out of Vanderbilt University found that the Bay Area would have the worst traffic in the nation when cities reopen, with an additional, are you guys ready for this? 42 minutes longer commute on average. At the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, transit agencies across the country started to face a drastic decline in ridership. In San Francisco, in particular, the SFMTA shut down a majority of bus lines and closed the light rail indefinitely. In May, BART was operating with 93% fewer riders. To bring ridership back up, public transit agencies need to regain the trust of riders. This will certainly be a big thing we'll be talking about today. If not, the only people taking public transit are going to be those who have no other choice. As cities prepare to reopen, public transit systems have started to experiment with different safety measures. This includes encouraging physical distancing, of course. I'm very interested to hear from Director Tumlin how the physical distancing is going to look on our subway system, enforcing mandatory masks, amplifying cleaning protocols, utilizing new technology, and of course, increasing the number of trains and buses. The pandemic also left public transit agencies in desperate need of funding. From the stimulus package, the CARES Act, San Francisco received over $700 million in relief. That's only a short-term fix though. It could take time to see ridership numbers return to normal. In the meantime, officials will have to explore new revenue streams. Some of these methods we discussed include vehicle miles traveled tax, which California may pilot, congestion pricing. I think everybody's heard about this one. Could actually be happening as early as next year. Super interested in what the director has to say there. And raising fare prices, which the SFMTA was actually looking at way before the pandemic. One of the key factors in reducing the strain travelers put on the region's transportation infrastructure will rely heavily on alternative modes of transportation and, you guessed it, the business community. As seen through initiatives like the Slow Streets program and quick build projects, when you make infrastructure that's safe and accessible to more people, it will result in more users. How and when employees go back to could also significantly impact the number of people on the roadways and riding public transit. Employers are exploring a hodgepodge of policies such as telecommuting, staggering start times, and rotating weekday schedules. I don't know about you guys, but the last time I had a rotating weekday schedule was kindergarten back in Canada. So this is going to be an interesting time. Lastly, this is my quick plug I have to do before we bring on the director. We would love for you guys to stay engaged with us. If you're not already a member of SF.citi, we'd love for you to join our coalition of tech leaders committed to shaping the tech policy landscape of San Francisco. Learn more at our membership page, which we're going to be popping right into the chat. All right. I'm back up now, and we're going to do a quick poll of the room, and then we will bring the director on. And here y'all go. I am super curious. When do you plan to take public transportation again? We'll give a minute or so for everybody to get their votes in. Oh, I see we are all over the map here. This is an interesting poll. All right. We don't have anybody answer, I never stopped taking public transit yet. Interesting. Okay, I will just let a couple more folks get their vote in, and then we will move on. Bueller, last call. All right, I'm going to share the results. This is an interesting one. So as y'all can see, more than a third said that they will not be taking public transit again until there is a vaccine, with the second most common result being September. Interesting. It's going to be quite a summer, everybody. All right. Now that we have got that out of the way, I would love to bring on the man of the hour, Director Tumlin. Come aboard.
Hey, Jen.
How's it going?
It's been pretty intense.
Yeah, what's your background there? What is that? Like a
it's the Rosepack Chinatown Station, Central Subway.
Oh, wow, it is too. That's super cool. I love seeing what everyone comes up with for backgrounds.
All of mine are transit themed, of course.
Of course. All right, awesome. Well, Director, it is great to have you here today. I've got an exciting conversation lined up, and I'm sure you guys have a lot of questions to get to, so we will get to it. First off, how has it been taking over a major department in this totally wild, unprecedented time? Bet you didn't plan this one.
So I started this job in late December of 2019, which was, of course, 15 years ago. And I took the job very much against my better judgment. This is like, I'd always thought of this job as the second worst job in my industry until Andy Byford resigned in New York. And right, and then a month later, the first COVID case arrives in the Bay Area. And a month after that was the mayor's emergency order, and a month after that was shelter in place. So it has been intense. I had expected at this point to be going to funerals every week of my staff, as many of my colleagues have around the United States. 100 bus operators died in New York as a result of COVID.
Wow. Do you guys have some sort of, is there a coalition or some sort of group? I imagine you guys must all be pretty connected.
Yeah, so the American Public Transit Association, plus our own personal connections, keep us interacting. So we try to keep each other informed, but the situations that we're each facing are in many ways very unique.
Yeah.
And so, so for us, actually, the cities that we have been most paying attention to are cities like Seoul and Taipei, and to a certain degree, Hong Kong and Singapore, but the government structure there is so very different that it's really Taipei and Seoul that I think offer the best learnings about how to get through this successfully. And of course, they're doing many things that, because they have a national COVID response policy, and we do not, they are far ahead of us.
So what are they working on?
Well, I mean, they've mostly reopened their economies. They've fully reopened public transit. Of course, they very early on eliminated social distancing on public transit because it's an impossible strategy, and substituted a whole array of other mitigations, as well as doing very sophisticated national and regional risk assessments, looking at what is the actual transmission risk, what are the potential mitigation strategies, how long are people doing the risky activity. So it's, it's time multiplied by risk, and then assessed against value. And something that has become clear in every region as they've reopened their economy is that economies don't work without thriving public transit. And it's a simple geometry. It takes up more than 10 times as much space per person to move somebody in a car than it does in a bus, and 100 times more than a BART train. So, so if we don't make public transit work, and if we don't allow public transit to serve its full capacity, public transit ends up becoming the primary brake on additional economic recovery. Because in transportation, fundamentally, we're in the economic development business. That's our primary function. We create land value and we allow people to get to work.
So we actually had a conversation with your predecessor. I remember SF.citi did last year, and one of the things that he shared was there's a high amount of folks across all income levels that use SFMTA, like more than other cities. What is the spread of folks that are using public transit look like here in San Francisco?
And right now or pre-COVID?
Like in pre-COVID, like who's powering the transit system?
So one of the things actually that's quite interesting that COVID has revealed. So historically in the transportation industry, we tend to be focused on the conventional 9 to 5 peak office commute.
Yeah.
And of course, it's office that has mostly turned into telecommuting jobs, mostly white collar, upper middle, and upper income professionals who can continue doing their business at their home laptop because they have a lovely office and lovely equipment at home. We still have crowding on minibus lines even now, and a remarkably different set of travel behaviors because the essential workers are still all working, and they're not in the financial district. They're in the neighborhood commercial districts, they're at the big institutions, and not just the hospitals. And they're working 24/7. Our staff were really interested in shutting down our OWL service, our late night, kind of 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. service. And I said, like, I'm not going to permit that until you actually ride those buses and talk to the people on those buses. And staff went out and did that, and they came back and were like, we cannot shut down the late night service because it's all the people who are actually running the base essential economy. But then typically, you know, it's everyone. We serve people of all incomes, and a lot of people who we, in a very inequitable way, call choice riders, people who have a choice of modes. You know, a lot of San Franciscans own cars, but mostly take Muni or ride their bikes to get around because it's easier and more efficient.
Makes sense. Is that normal for people to have so many different modes of transit, like in one household?
It's normal in real cities. It is very unusual in a US context outside of a handful of truly urban places.
Yeah, I would guess so. Just a quick reminder, folks, you can be submitting your questions as we have today's conversation. So what has been the biggest surprise about how COVID has affected your work?
There have been so many surprises. The emotional burden is, it's not that it's a surprise, but the amount of space that the emotional burden on staff consumes has, I think, it's surprised all of us to a certain degree, and that just the extent and depth of the tragedy and the ways in which this long, slowly unrolling tragedy that we're still at the very beginning of has affected people. You know, and not just people who are, you know, who have experienced a death in their family, and many people have. It's dealing with the fact that your kids are suddenly at home all day, every day. It's dealing with the fact that our frontline workers are terrified to come home because they have a member of a vulnerable population in their household. It is the fact that most people in government now are afraid of losing their job. And here in the United States, if you lose your job, you lose your healthcare. Yep. Your family loses your healthcare. And if you lose your job, you are likely going to lose your home pretty soon. And if you lose your home in the Bay Area, you don't get to stay here. So there's a level of pervasive terror in our workforce and in all of our riders that puts a huge burden on our work that goes way beyond the madness of just dealing with the technical requirements of the health and economic fallout of this time.
Wow. And to think that there's so much trauma going on with folks that are tasked with really difficult jobs, like, you know, this machine operating.
Yeah, it's really, really hard work. And I mean, it's also been amazing the ways in which this agency has stepped it up in this time. I spent my entire career in the public sector and came to this job with certain tired prejudices about, 9 to 5 public sector workers who sort of put in the hour and then clocking out. I have never in my entire life been with such hardworking, dedicated, and smart and creative people, completely dedicated to public service. And that's really at all levels of the agency.
Yeah.
The ways in which our shop workers have volunteered to take on car cleaning duty in order to keep our operators and the public safe. Hundreds of people are basically volunteering their time to sterilize minibuses. The fact that all of the line supervisors and managers and dispatchers, all of the executive team, are basically working 80-hour weeks and have been since the first emergency order. We're like, what is this week? No idea what week this is. I don't know what day of the week this is.
I know how long I've been at home. And I know that my husband's been at home at the exact same time as me every day. Yeah. So I think that's a good jumping off point. I'd love to talk about some of the creative things that you guys have been doing. And I'm going to start with one of my personal favorites, the Slow Streets program.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about, what your plans are with the program, and is there any chance this could stay?
Well, yeah, so slow streets came as a result of, so a disproportionate share of our workforce are members of vulnerable populations. We took a very aggressive stance to protect the health of our workforce. We have had only 13 total COVID positive cases in a 6,000 person agency, which means
Wow.
our COVID transmission rate is 0.2%. And all of those folks have recovered, all of them. And this is because all of our folks have been following the safety protocols, and a lot of people have been staying home. And that meant back in early April, in fact, it was Friday, April the 3rd, whatever that first Friday in April was, we saw that on the following Monday, about 40% of our frontline workers were going to be out on COVID-related leave, either because they were in the quarantine or were a vulnerable population. It was going to result in a complete catastrophe system-wide in the muni system. We spent the weekend completely rebuilding the entire transit service and made the tough call to not only eliminate, we'd already eliminated streetcar and cable car, we eliminated the rail system. And then we eliminated 3/4 of the bus lines, so we can throw all of our available resources at the 13 to 15 lines that carried the vast majority of our customers and served all the essential institutions, as well as serving the neighborhoods where people had the fewest choices. That meant we stripped a lot of service, like most of the Sunset was basically without any service at all.
Yeah.
So our response to that was investing heavily in what we called slow streets, creating traffic calm streets where we limited through traffic on low volume residential streets. So, people could still drive and get access to their garage and park on the street. But basically put up signs that said, this street is for people and cars can come here, but cars are guests. And we started in the Sunset because that was where we had removed most muni service, and then also Page Street through the Haight and NOPA area, where we'd also removed several bus lines. And yeah, it's been wildly successful. And we're learning a lot from the experiment. So we're trying to aggressively expand so that every neighborhood has a slow street where people can exercise. One of the big surprises has been the huge response from kids. So every time I go to check these streets out, it is full of small children learning to skateboard or bike for the first time, and extremely grateful parents who have been cooped up in small apartments with very active little children who need space to run around in safely. And I have never seen so many kids in San Francisco. So
Who knew we had them?
Yeah. We know that, and your poll results showed that people are going to continue to be nervous about transit. The geometry of mobility in San Francisco doesn't work if we all retreat in fear to our cars. So for folks who are uncomfortable taking transit, we need to make it possible for them to walk or bike or use a scooter or a skateboard or whatever micromobility device works. Because the geometry of micromobility is quite similar to the geometry of transit. There's basically no limit to the number of people San Francisco can move on a bike or a scooter. I can't move more people by car than I did back in December, because we are no longer demolishing African-American neighborhoods in order to widen streets and highways in San Francisco anymore. So we've got a fixed geometric limit on the number of cars that the city can move. And if we overemphasize the car, no one can move, and the economy stutters to a halt. So, we're trying to focus right now on dealing with the emergency itself and the health directive, while also looking forward to how do we pull this together into a network. At a certain point, we need to make the transition from what government is allowed to do under the emergency directive to the old cumbersome bureaucratic rules that are necessary for approving something as a project. One of the upsides to this unrolling, this slow-moving tragedy, is that it has demonstrated that when all of the stupid bureaucratic regulations that get in the way of government being able to do its business, when those rules are stripped away, government can get shit done, particularly when we're really, really clear about our objectives and our values. I mean, we've done 15 years worth of work in 2 months. And we can't quite continue at this pace because staff are really getting burnt out. But we can continue at almost this pace if only our regulations were structured not around preserving the privileges of the establishment, but actually solving the real problems that cities face.
Y'all are speaking my language. All right, let's talk about those regulations. What do you want to see gone? What'll make your life better?
So many things. My favorite broken regulation is the California Environmental Quality Act. So as many of you know, in San Francisco, we were forbidden from installing bike racks for 3 years because of the dire threat to the environment of the state of California that bike lanes posed. The bike lane injunction was sort of world famous for the gross abuse of what was a very well-intentioned regulatory act, and it's done a lot of good. Like CEQA has done a lot of good, but CEQA has nothing to do with actually promoting good environmental outcomes. All it is a legal disclosure instrument for anything that is a project. And so what it prioritizes is, it's basically a preservationist move. What it prioritizes is the privileged establishment. So in order to make use of CEQA, you need to be able to afford CEQA lawyers. And the presumption of CEQA is that all change is bad. So it doesn't ask the question, where should we put the wastewater treatment plant? It says a wastewater treatment plant is bad. Well, let's just assume that. And we're gonna give people with power the ability to stop it from happening in their neighborhood. And we'll just push it somewhere else. CEQA has historically treated transportation the same way.
Yeah.
So it's, having government regulations that actually support good outcomes is actually something that we're wanting to achieve across the board, including how we deal with mobility technology. Rather than like capping the number of scooters in San Francisco, we should be regulating according to directing private companies to help best achieve the public good and regulating them to minimize negative outcomes, like the fact that, 2 years ago, scooters had a tendency to tip over and block sidewalks, and users had a tendency to ride on sidewalks in a way that endangered the health of elderly people. So structuring our regulation around positive outcomes and minimizing negative outcomes is something that we would like to see across the board. And I can give you actually a whole list of other like well-intentioned but completely broken bureaucratic rules that get in the way of government being able to get its job done.
It's like the definition of California right there.
Yes, yes.
You would
always prioritizing the privileges of the establishment over the needs of newcomers.
You would think if Elon Musk can send NASA astronauts into space, like we can probably partner to get scooters out on the street. Maybe.
Yeah, we'll see.
All right, well, we'll have more on that one, hopefully. Okay, well, I got another elephant in the room. Obviously, scooters is a big one, but fare hikes. Let's talk about fare hikes.
So, like all municipal agencies, the SFMTA has a built-in structural deficit, meaning that every year our expenses increase at a faster rate than our revenues. And this is true it's really true for every government agency because the way in which government finance is so broken in California. So government expenditure is driven by labor. So we need to pay our workforce a living wage in order to keep up with the incredibly rapidly increasing cost of living in the Bay Area. Like in order for us to compete for talent, we need to pay people like a decent wage. And believe me, like my people are not overpaid. They're like, in fact, in many ways, we can't compete with the private sector for the basic talent that we need. Meanwhile, our revenues typically increase with inflation. So expenditures increase with cost of living, Revenues increase at best with inflation, except for all of our sources of revenue that whoever wrote the initial legislation, like the federal gas tax, never bothered to index it to inflation. So many of our revenues actually decline over time. So the gap widens every year. And in San Francisco, with a boom-bust economy, in a boom year, that government structural deficit gap widens even further.
Yeah.
Because again, our revenues are not keeping up with costs. So in order to deal with this problem, we raise fares as a matter of policy every single year based upon formula. And our formula is the average between the Bay Area cost of living and our operator wages. Split the difference and increase fares on a percentage basis each year, rather than artificially keeping fares flat, which means actually they're declining relative to costs, and then panicking every 4 years and having to do a 20% jump in fares that creates all kinds of political angst. So pre-COVID, in a boom economy, we're like, oh, we do this every single year. We've got to either we need to increase fares or we need to cut service, like one or the other. And
business.
Yeah, part of my fundamental responsibility as a director is solving for this fundamental structural deficit that is the cause of Muni's poor performance, and particularly its lack of reliability, right? We need a stable financial base where we have a predictable amount of money that matches our costs every single year. So we went forward with the fare increase. Of course, pre-COVID, it was very unpopular because in the peak of a boom economy, it is really, really hard on our lower income riders who are so rent challenged. And it's even harder now in a post-COVID environment. And now our entire budget is completely trashed. So we get to have a completely different conversation about our budget over the coming 12 months. To determine just how much service we have to cut or where we're getting revenue from, because we will lose over $200 million between now and the end of June.
Wow.
CARES Act replaces some of that, but it doesn't solve our fiscal year 2021 problem.
So one thing, I would love to speak more about what kind of alternative funding and revenue we could help bring in, but I just quickly wanted to ask, are all public transit systems kind of in North America, is it generally set up with this type of deficit, or does it change from city to city?
It changes from city to city. In California, it is the worst because of Prop 13, where property taxes decline in value over time. So older cities in particular, or cities that have a stable population base, are specifically grossly disadvantaged. So Oakland is particularly disadvantaged because it's remarkably stable, its infrastructure is old, and so its tax base gets smaller and smaller and smaller every year, particularly relative to its costs. But it is not an atypical problem nationally. And it's sort of this problem where we have forgotten about the role of democracy, that there are so many people who believe that government is a magical wish fulfillment machine with limitless resources. And a denial of the fact that government is a coming together of people to pool resources in order to facilitate the public good, and in particular to not only facilitate the larger economy, but also to correct for inequities so that all of us have the same opportunities to contribute our creativity and entrepreneurialism to the larger public good. Like, this country thrives, or has historically thrived, to the extent that opportunity was open to everyone. That is what will enable us to compete globally, particularly as China emerges, as this global powerhouse. The only way we're going to be able to compete with that is to make sure that this false, promise that has always been a false promise. And we actually come around to making it a true promise of enabling the entrepreneurialism and skill and creativity of literally every one of our residents for the first time in history.
I feel like we're only at 12:38, but if there was going to be a mic drop, that sounds like that is the spot for today. And I mean, it's hard to compete with China when they don't have all the red tape that we're talking about. They don't have any tape, I don't think.
Nope.
Well, okay, so I'm curious. Obviously, there's the CARES Act. There's some relief funding that's coming. How on earth does a public transit agency make money if it's not for fares? What are you guys looking at for the future to stabilize?
Yeah, well, it's tough. So there's a conversation happening in Washington about a second tranche of federal funding in order to keep public transit alive for the next 12 months, because for urban America, like the economic recovery can't happen without it. We are interested in having a larger conversation with the Board of Supervisors and with our sister agency at the SFCTA and with the regional agency, the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, about how do we set up a stable financial base for public transit, not just here at Muni, but for all 26 of the Bay Area transit providers. In San Francisco, part of the solution may well be the downtown congestion pricing study that the SFCTA is currently leading, and that is continuing to move forward. The last effort at congestion pricing happened conveniently in the last recession in 2008. We had sort of been worried that the current economic crisis would stall the congestion pricing study this time around, but that does not appear to be the case. There actually seems to be greater interest in it. In part because we all know the economic catastrophe that will follow from too many people trying to drive.
Yep.
I think there's also greater recognition that congestion pricing needs to be looked at not just as a revenue measure, but as a primary means of advancing equity and fostering business success. So if congestion pricing is done stupidly, it just becomes a way for rich people to bypass congestion. If it is done intelligently, it can actually be one of the most powerful things that we can do to advance equity, particularly when we look at what happens to that net revenue, and also what exceptions we make for people given the complexity of their lives, like shift workers who have to drive downtown in the PM peak, but then get off work from their dishwashing job at 3 o'clock in the morning when I'm running crap uni service. So I think this time around, the staff and our Board of Supervisors are taking a much more sophisticated approach at using congestion pricing as a means of making the whole system work and acknowledging that it is grossly inequitable. That I charge $3 for somebody to have 1.5 square feet on a packed 38 Geary bus, whereas it's free to take your giant RV down Geary Boulevard and park in your office building downtown where you get free parking, right? But that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So looking at congestion pricing across all modes and thinking of it as rent, right? I have the key limitation on the mobility system is our available street space. I have a responsibility for managing that limited space to achieve the highest public good. And I should be rewarding people who are making the most space efficient use of that space. I should be paying somebody $5 to take the crush loaded 38 Geary bus and charging somebody $15 who wants their 300 square feet of space because they want their tunes and don't want to have to deal with the array of humans that are found on minibuses. You're welcome to do that, but I need to charge you rent.
No, that absolutely makes sense. So I'm guessing San Francisco's approach is not going to be, New York style. That was clearly like revenue driven, but more like London or Stockholm. Where, if folks that are interested in learning about congestion pricing, where would you send them to look up after today's event?
I think that the most interesting case studies are actually Stockholm and Milan, which were very outcome focused and allow their price to vary by congestion levels, and specifically have used that money to invest in better transportation alternatives for people who would otherwise be driving. And the economic result of both of those studies has been immensely positive, right? The transportation system can move twice as many people if we get rid of that wasteful congestion. And just remember that, you know, congestion is simply what happens when the demand for mobility equals the supply. For every other commodity in society, when demand exceeds supply, we raise the price in order to bring them back into balance. Uniquely in mobility, we use time to balance supply and demand. Congestion is simply a cue. It's forcing people to stand in line for accessing the service. And it is extraordinarily wasteful, and it assumes that poor people have no value on their time. And what's clear when you go out and actually survey low-income households, many of them actually have a far greater value of time than wealthy people. Shift workers get fired when they're late for their work. I'm not. You know, single moms get charged by the minute when they're late to pick up their kids from daycare, and have far more complex travel patterns that really give them no choice other than to drive, because they're making all these complicated triangular journeys. So yeah, so I'm hopeful actually that can be something that we can move forward with. Probably the soonest that could happen is 2 years from now. It requires state legislation, and the state is gummed up given everything that they have to deal with. But there could be few better things for the transportation system than finally being able to use price, not only to balance supply and demand, but to make the investments that we need in providing better choices to those who have the fewest choices.
Awesome. That's the best congestion pricing explanation I've heard yet. Okay, we got a queue of folks that are asking all kinds of questions. Let's try to bang through as many of these as we can get. Many of the questions are all about the same thing. What is Muni going to look like post shelter in place? What physical distancing? You know, could you give us an idea of what the experience will be like?
Yeah, so one of the core questions is, are we stuck with physical distancing, which does not work on public transit and will hobble us and our ability to serve, or can we substitute other measures? So the answer to that is very complicated, will involve a lot of health science, but the thing that we're working on is recognizing that there are two critical streams of work that have to happen at the same time. One is health science, which is well, you'd think it's relatively straightforward. It's actually very complicated.
No, not at all.
Yeah, the other is the emotional response. We have to build confidence in transit, and people make their decisions not based on health science, but based on their emotions. And that is a conundrum that we share with the restaurant industry. Like, we have to bring trust back to public transit, and we need to bring joy back to cities in order for urbanism to work again. That's something that we basically share with all restaurants and many retailers.
Yeah. All right. Is it fair to say that SFMTA trails other California cities in introducing innovative transit solutions? You know, e-bikes, bike lanes, scooters, slow streets, et cetera, et cetera.
I think in the past we have not acted quickly enough. I think that will be rather different under my tenure.
Awesome.
So but that said, I'm going to be far more insistent that, to the extent that we're partnering with private technology, that we will hold private technology to the public good. And private mobility firms in particular continue to confuse user convenience with system efficiency. And post-IPO, every mobility tech company wants to chase after more exquisite convenience for the privileged, because that's where the money is. And there is not nearly as much money to be made in providing essential services to people with the fewest choices. So this is going to be the big conversation that we have moving forward. And particularly, I think, with ride hail. Every indicator of success, whether it's congestion or greenhouse gas emissions or social equity or accessibility for the disabled, ride-hail scores really badly in its current service delivery model, and we need to change that. They're a critical part of the mobility system, but they need to do better at delivering the public good.
I think Simon's question actually dovetails perfectly into this. How do we prevent the perception that transit will become a service just for the less advantaged?
So it has to be like partly that emotional truth of just trusting transit again, which is essential. But it's also we need to provide better service. That was actually a key part of the reason why we eliminated 3/4 of transit lines is we were going to provide complete crap service on 76 lines.
Yeah.
And we knew that would not work. So there's been a whole array of innovations that we have quietly implemented over the last 6 weeks, including abandoning schedules. We turned on a technology that we've had for a couple of years called headway management. That instead of asking drivers to meet at certain locations at certain times, we said, no, all you need to do is to maintain even spacing between the bus in front of you and the bus behind you. Because what's clear is that our riders don't care if the schedule says the bus comes every 9 minutes or every 12 minutes. Our riders care when 2 buses show up at the same time, followed by a 20-minute gap.
Yep.
So we've delivered, like, despite the complete collapse of our system, we're providing better reliability during COVID than I think we ever have in history, and we intend to continue that. So we're no longer going to lie to the public about how much service we're providing and then deliver less than that. We're going to be truthful about what our resources are and allocate those limited resources to serve the greatest needs, and then do a much better job at the actual delivery of that to the public in the form of reliability and customer orientation.
So there's a certain freshly minted supervisor that ran on a campaign talking about creating free muni. What do you think about that? Do you think there is a future for free muni, or is there a better alternative?
So it's, from my perspective, again, my primary objective is providing a stable financial base where our revenue rises with our costs so that we can deliver reliable service. Fares are historically a critical part. I mean, they're only 20% of our revenue, but they're 20% of our revenue. I am more than happy to negotiate around a alternative strategy. But we need to put the reliability and quality of the service first, because that is what drives ridership, not the fare.
Okay. So to clarify on one of our earlier questions, when we do bring back the muni and all of that, are we going to see like middle seats, kind of like on planes? Like, is it going to physically look different in the way that people are seated?
So my hope is no. My hope is that we can take an actual urban, civilized country approach where we abandon social distancing on Muni. I don't know whether we're going to get there.
Yeah.
But most likely, I think what we're finding is that our passengers actually figure out how to socially distance themselves. And that the systems that have done the blocking off of seats, it doesn't really work. It gets in the way of our ability to sterilize the buses. And then it prevents people from the same household being able to sit next to each other, which is perfectly fine on Muni.
Okay. So to make sure I understand, it sounds like there's going to be some suggested protocol, and then we'll kind of see if people are following that protocol to start.
Well, and that is exactly what we're finding today. I mean, I ride the buses regularly and talk to our operators, almost daily. And there are certainly some exceptions, but rather prominent, that we need to take care of. But for the most part, most of our passengers are following the rules.
Okay. So I bet you get this question a lot from Steve. What's the chance of a monthly pass coming? Would that be a good thing, bad thing for budgeting purposes?
What do you mean about monthly pass?
An inexpensive monthly pass to ride public transit across the entire Bay Area.
Oh, across the entire Bay Area? I think that is extremely unlikely, as much as I would like to see it. And the underlying problem is that here in California, we have delegated transit system funding to the smallest unit of government.
Yeah.
So we have no real regional or real state funding for transit. It's funded locally. And with local funding, like from taxation follows governance. So by law, transit has to be governed by the unit of government that funds it. So it becomes very, very difficult. In fact, illegal to do a lot of what would seem like sensible, fair integration schemes. Plus, the values of each of those government agencies are very different. So even requiring the same discount programs for, say, seniors or disabled people. Here in San Francisco, we place a higher value on social equity. And if we had a single regional policy around fair integration for disadvantaged populations, we'd have to worsen our equity programs in order to match the lowest common denominator of the region. So I am a big fan of regionalism, and we're working on some actual doable solutions for integrating services from a customer perspective.
Okay.
But many of the well-intentioned plans that have been put forward by advocates and state legislators actually fail to understand the basics of how transit works. And those measures would result in significant unintended negative consequences, particularly in San Francisco.
Fair. I can tell you, I'm from Toronto, and I watched them floundering for about a decade to integrate one card alone. So what's a city that you're looking at that has done, some interesting integration or from a user perspective that perhaps we could look to?
Yeah, so we're intrigued by the regional Verkehrsverbunds in Germany and Switzerland. So these are not that different from what Toronto has done, but they're basically regional transit coordinating councils that take 20 different transit operators and make them appear to be a single system from the user perspective. So it doesn't force integration of anything, but it basically takes all the user experience design and unifies that. Those regional Verkehrsverbunds, though, come with massive amounts of federal funding in order to make them work. So this is the challenge, that we have no federal or state transit strategy here in the United States because we're fundamentally anti-urban in America. And without extra money, making a Verkehrsverbund work requires stripping away a lot of service, particularly from the wealthier operators, in order to equalize things across the region. So that's kind of where we're stuck. So in the meantime, some of us general managers are kind of conspiring behind the scenes to see how much we could advance, how much we could sort of quietly advance of regional integration that doesn't cost us massive amounts to the extent that we'd have to significantly cut service in order to be able to deliver.
And when you say integration, you talking ride hail, scooters, everybody?
So here in San Francisco, yes. I mean, my objective is to get to true mobility as a service, where my job as director of the SFMTA is to manage the street for the public good, including both the public and private operations on the street. Getting there requires a very different approach from the California Public Utilities Commission, which makes true mobility as a service illegal, as well as a radically different approach from the federal government, whose AV bill would be a catastrophe under the draft as it stood back in January. Basically turning the streets over to the convenience of individual technology companies, which would allow them to form the same sorts of monopolies and cartels that doomed the taxi cab industry. So I mean, what we're watching is a repeat of early 20th century history, where mobility technology is following all of the same catastrophic mistakes that occurred in the 1930s. And the regulators are doing exactly what they did in the 1930s, which in mobility doomed us but in telecommunications actually came out really much better. So I'm looking to take a more telecom-oriented approach to the regulation of mobility rather than the, the historic General Motors-based approach, which is what we're
All right.
repeating.
Yeah. That's the first time I've heard someone say telecom positively in a hot minute.
Compared to mobility, compared to turning things over to, the new versions of General Motors.
Yeah.
Yeah. The
I would say
telecom
so.
reforms in the 1930s were really good stuff.
All right, cool. Let's end with a quick question. I would love to hear, for everybody that's on today's event and everybody that watches, they want to make public transit better. They want to get around their city better. They want everybody to get around better. What is the top maybe one or two things that you want everyone to do after today's event? What can they do to get engaged?
That's a good question. So there are plenty of interesting avenues for engagement. I mean, everything from Spur to the San Francisco Transit Writers Union to the various business-oriented organizations such as yours. All of those are good. Be organized. We need revenue to survive. So some of the most important things are to start gearing up. And the next time we have an opportunity to be at the ballot is in November of 2022, which will be a big ballot.
Yep.
We need to start a process now of figuring out what is going to be on the November 2022 ballot and how bold do we want to go. We need technology companies to be in partnership with us and to understand the difference between user convenience and system efficiency. So much of what mobility tech tries to do is to make things super convenient for the user while destroying the efficiency of the overall system. Don't want that, want both. And I think there are ways, if we're in partnership, that we can get both. I think that there is a lot of lobbying that the private sector can do to help clear out pointless state regulations that get in the way of our ability to deliver. So for example, just having a statutory exemption from CEQA over transportation projects that happen in the existing public right-of-way that don't increase vehicle miles traveled. Like, really, we can just do that. Like, why am I having to take all this time doing an environmental impact report on a bike lane? This is really silly. There's other regulatory reform stuff like reforming the congestion management agencies and so on. There's kind of a whole long list of that there. It's all kind of wonkish. Reforming the California Public Utilities Commission to really lean in on helping municipalities to manage the public right-of-way for the public good and giving us the tools that we need, giving us the lane to swim in. Like, we don't want municipalities to run amok, but we need to recognize that different municipalities have different needs and somewhat different ways of defining the essential elements of the public good. And I think there's also another thing that I think is also super important in this time is to remember how much stress we are all under in this tragedy. People are emotionally exhausted. And when we get emotionally exhausted, many of us get a little impatient and maybe a little mean. Now more than ever, and particularly from the business community, we need to foster a culture of public civility and kindness to each other. I would argue there's probably nothing more important for us to do now than simply that. It is very easy, particularly given what's going on to the federal level, it's very easy to fall into the Trump approach of dividing us. This is a time when we need to come together and understand we are literally all in the same small leaky boat. And the only way we're going to make it to shore is if we recognize that we are in this together, and that requires kindness and compassion.
I love it. All right, Director Jeff Tumlin of SFMTA, thank you so much for today's conversation, and we hope to see everybody back in a couple of weeks. We're going to have Secretary of State Padilla from California joining us for the future of elections. All right, have a good rest of your day. Please get some sunshine. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everyone, for joining.
Bye, all.
See ya.